Old Mortality by Sir Walter Scott, first published in 1816. Narrated by Bryan Stuart for the Very Nice Dear YouTube channel. Chapter 1. Why seeks he with unwearied toil through death's dim walks to urge his way, reclaim his long asserted spoil, and lead oblivion into day? Langhorne. Most readers, says the manuscript of Mr. Pattison, must have witnessed with delight the joyous burst which attends the dismissing of a village school on a fine summer evening. The buoyant spirit of childhood, repressed with so much difficulty during the tedious hours of discipline, may then be seen to explode, as it were, in shout and song and frolic, as the little urchins join in groups on their playground and arrange their matches of sport for the evening. But there is one individual who partakes of the relief afforded by the moment of dismission, whose feelings are not so obvious to the eye of the spectator, or so apt to receive his sympathy. I mean the teacher himself, who, stunned with the hum and suffocated with the closeness of the schoolroom, has spent the whole day, himself against a host, in controlling petulance, exciting indifference to action, striving to enlighten stupidity, and labouring to soften obstinacy, and whose very powers of intellect have been confounded by hearing the same dull lesson repeated 100 times by rote, and only varied by the various blunders of the reciters. Even the flowers of classic genius, with which his solitary fancy is most gratified, have been rendered degraded in his imagination by their connection with tears, with errors, and with punishment, so that the eclogues of Virgil and odes of Horace are each inseparably allied in association with the sullen figure and monotonous recitation of some blubbering schoolboy. If to these mental distresses are added a delicate frame of body, and a mind ambitious of some higher distinction than that of being a tyrant of childhood, the reader may have some slight conception of the relief which a solitary walk in the cool of a fine summer evening affords to this head which has ached, and the nerves which have been shattered for so many hours in plying the irksome task of public instruction. To me these evening strolls have been the happiest hours of an unhappy life, and if any gentle reader shall hereafter find pleasure in perusing these lucubrations, I am not unwilling he should know that the plan of them has been usually traced in these moments, when relief from toil and clamour, combined with the quiet scenery around me, has disposed my mind to the task of composition. My chief haunt in these hours of golden leisure is the banks of a small stream, which, winding through a lone vale of green bracken, passes in front of the village schoolhouse of Gandercleugh. For the first quarters of a mile, perhaps, I may be disturbed from my meditations in order to return the scrape or doffed bonnet of such stragglers amongst my pupils as fish for trouts or minnows in the little brook, or seek rushes and wildflowers by its margin. But beyond the space I have mentioned, the juvenile anglers do not, after sunset, voluntarily extend their excursions. The cause is that farther up the Nare valley, and in a recess which seems scooped out to the side of the steep heathy bank, there is a deserted burial ground, which the little cowards are fearful of approaching in the twilight. To me, however, this place has an inexpressible charm. It has been long the favourite termination of my walks, and, if my kind patron forgets not his promise, will, and probably at no very distant day, be my final resting place after my mortal pilgrimage. Note by Mr. Jedediah Cleishbottom, that I kept my plight in this melancholy matter with my deceased and lamented friend, appeareth from a handsome headstone erected at my proper charges in this spot, bearing the name and calling of Peter Pattison, with the date of his nativity and sepulture, together with a testimony of his merits, attested by myself as his superior and patron, J.C. It is a spot which possesses all the solemnity of feeling attached to a burial ground, without exciting those of a more unpleasing description. Having been very little used for many years, the few hillocks which rise above the level plain are covered with the same short velvet turf. The monuments, of which there are not above 7 or 8, are half sunk in the ground and overgrown with moss. No newly erected tomb disturbs the sober serenity of our reflections by reminding us of recent calamity, and no rank springing grass forces upon our imagination the recollection that it owes its dark luxuriance to the foul and festering remnants of mortality which ferment beneath. The daisy which sprinkles the sod, and the harebell which hangs over it, derive their pure nourishment from the dew of heaven, and their growth impresses us with no degrading or disgusting recollections. Death has indeed been here, and its traces are before us, but they are softened and deprived of their horror by our distance from the period when they have been first impressed. Those who sleep beneath are only connected with us by the reflection that they have once been what we are now, and that, as their relics are now identified with their mother earth, or shall at some future period undergo the same transformation. Yet although the moss has been collected on the most modern of these humble tombs during 4 generations of mankind, the memory of some of those who sleep beneath them is still held in reverent remembrance. It is true that upon the largest, and to an antiquary the most interesting monument of the group, which bears the effigies of a doughty knight in his hood of mail, with his shield hanging on his breast, the armorial bearings are defaced by time, and a few worn-out letters may be read at the pleasure of the decipherer. Dienis Johann de Hamel, or Johann de Lamel. And it is also true that of another tomb, richly sculptured with an ornamental cross, mitre, and pastoral staff, tradition can only aver that a certain nameless bishop lies interred here. But upon other 2 stones which lie beside, may still be read in rude prose and ruder rhyme the history of those who sleep beneath them. They belong, we are assured by the epitaph, to the class of persecuted Presbyterians who afforded a melancholy subject for the history in the times of Charles II and his successor. Note, James, 7th King of Scotland at the name, and 2nd according to the numeration of the Kings of England. In returning from the Battle of Pentland Hills, a party of the insurgents had been attacked in this glen by a small detachment of the King's troops, and 3 or 4 either killed in the skirmish, or shot after being made prisoners, as rebels taken with arms in their hands. The peasantry continued to attach to the tombs of those victims of prelacy an honour which they do not render to the more splendid mausoleums, and, when they point them out to their sons and narrate the fate of the sufferers, usually conclude by exhorting them to be ready, should times call for it, to resist to the death in the cause of civil and religious liberty, like the brave forefathers. Although I am far from venerating the peculiar tenets asserted by those who call themselves the followers of those men, and whose intolerance and narrow-minded bigotry are at least as conspicuous as their devotional zeal, yet it is without depreciating the memory of those sufferers, many of whom united the independent sentiments of a Hampden with the suffering zeal of a Hooper or a Latimer. On the other hand, it would be unjust to forget that many even of those who had been most active in crushing what they conceived the rebellious and seditious spirit of those unhappy wanderers displayed themselves, when called upon to suffer for their political and religious opinions, the same daring and devoted zeal, tinctured, as in their case, with chivalrous loyalty, as in the former with republican enthusiasm. It has often been remarked of the Scottish character that the stubbornness with which it is moulded shows most to advantage in adversity, when it seems akin to the native sycamore of their hills, which scorns to be biased in its mode of growth even by the influence of the prevailing wind, but, shooting its branches with equal boldness in every direction, shows no weather side to the storm, and may be broken but can never be bended. It must be understood that I speak of my countrymen as they fall under my own observation. When in foreign countries I have been informed that they are more docile, but it is time to return from this digression. One summer evening, as in a stroll such as I have described, I approached this deserted mansion of the dead. I was somewhat surprised to hear sounds distinct from those which usually soothe its solitude. The gentle chiding, namely, of the brook, and the sighing of the wind in the boughs of the 3 gigantic ash trees which mark the cemetery. The clink of a hammer was on this occasion distinctly heard, and I entertained some alarm that a marsh deck, long meditated by the 2 proprietors whose estates were divided by my favourite brook, was about to be drawn up the glen, in order to substitute its rectilinear deformity for the graceful winding of the natural boundary. Note, I deem it fitting that the reader should be apprised that this limitary boundary between the conterminous heritable property of his honour the Laird de Gandercleugh and his honour the Laird de Gustube was to have been in fashion an agar, or rather muris, of uncemented granite, called by the vulgar a dry-stained dyke, surmounted or coped cispite viridi, i.e. with a sod turf. Truly their honours fell into discord concerning 2 roods of marshy ground near the cove called the Bedrol's Baild, and the controversy, having some years bygone been removed from before the judges of the land, with whom it abode long, even unto the great city of London and the assembly of the nobles therein, is, as I may say, ad hoc in pedent. J.C. As I approached, I was agreeably undeceived. An old man was seated upon the monument of the slaughtered Presbyterians, and busily employed in deepening with his chisel the letters of the inscription, which, announcing in scriptural language the promised blessings of futurity to be the lot of the slain, anathematized the murderers with corresponding violence. A blue bonnet of unusual dimensions covered the grey hairs of the pious worksman. His dress was a large old-fashioned coat of the coarse cloth called hodding grey, usually worn by the elder peasants, with waistcoat and breeches the same, and the whole suit, though still in decent repair, had obviously seen a train of long service. Strong clouted shoes, studded with hobnails, and gramoche or leggings, made of thick black cloth, completed his equipment. Beside him, fed among the graves, a pony, the companion of his journey, whose extreme whiteness, as well as its projecting bones and hollow eyes, indicated its antiquity. I was harnessed in the most simple manner, with a pair of branks, a hair tether or halter, and a sunk or cushion of straw instead of a bridle and saddle. A canvas pouch hung around the neck of the animal, for the purpose, probably, of containing the rider's tools, and anything else he might have occasion to carry with him. Although I have never seen the old man before, yet from the singularity of his employment and the style of his equipage, I had no difficulty in recognising a religious itinerant whom I had often heard talked of, and who was known in various parts of Scotland by the title of Old Mortality. Where this man was born, or what his real name was, I have never been able to learn, nor are the motives which made him desert his home and adopt the erratic mode of life which he pursued known to me except very generally. According to the belief of most people, he was a native of either the country of Dumfries or Galway, and lineally descended from some of those champions of the Covenant, whose deeds and sufferings were his favourite theme. He is said to have held, at one period of his life, a small moorland farm, but whether from pecuniary losses or domestic misfortune, he had long renounced that and every other gainful calling. In the language of the Scripture, he left his house, his home, and his kindred, and wandered about until the day of his death, a period of nearly 30 years. During this long pilgrimage, the pious enthusiast regulated his circuit so as annually to visit the graves of the unfortunate Covenanters who suffered by the sword or by the executioner during the reigns of the last two monarchs of the Stuart line. These are numerous in the western districts of Ayr, Galway, and Dumfries, but they are also to be found in other parts of Scotland, wherever the fugitives had fought or fallen or suffered by military or civil execution. Their tombs are often apart from all human habitation, in the remote moors and wilds to which the wanderers had fled for concealment. But wherever they existed, Old Mortality was sure to visit them when his annual round brought them within his reach. In the most lonely recesses of the mountains, the moorfowl shooter has been often surprised to find him busied in the cleaning of the moss from the grey stones, renewing with his chisel the half-defaced inscriptions, and repairing the emblems of death with which these simple monuments are usually adorned. Motives of the most sincere, though fanciful devotion, induced the old man to dedicate so many years of existence to perform this tribute to the memory of the deceased warriors of the Church. He considered himself as fulfilling a sacred duty, while renewing to the eyes of posterity the decaying emblems of the zeal and sufferings of their forefathers, and thereby trimming, as it were, the beacon light, which was to warn future generations to defend their religion even unto the blood. In all his wanderings, the old pilgrim never seemed to need, or was known to accept, pecuniary assistance. It is true, his wants were very few, for wherever he went he found ready quarters in the house of some Cameronian of his own sect, or of some other religious person. The hospitality which was reverentially paid to him was always acknowledged, by repairing the gravestones, if there existed any, belonging to the family of ancestors of his host. As the wanderer was usually to be seen bent on this pious task within the precincts of some country churchyard, or reclined in the solitary tombstone amongst the heath, disturbing the plover and the blackcock with a clink of his chisel and mallet, with his old white pony grazing by his side, he acquired, from his converse among the dead, the popular appellation of Old Mortality. The character of such a man could have in it little connection even with innocent gaiety. Yet, among those of his own religious persuasion, he is reported to have been cheerful. The descendants of persecutors, or those whom he supposed guilty of entertaining similar tenets, and the scoffers at religion by whom he was sometimes assailed, he usually termed the generation of vipers. Conversing with others, he was grave and sententious, not without a cast of severity, but is said never to have been observed to give way to violent passion, excepting upon one occasion, when a mischievous truant boy defaced with a stone the nose of a cherub's face, which the old man was engaged in retouching. I am, in general, a sparer of the rod, notwithstanding the maxim of Solomon, for which schoolboys have little reason to thank his memory, but on this occasion I deemed it proper to show that I did not hate the child. But I must return to the circumstances attending my first interview with this interesting enthusiast. In accosting old Mortality, I did not fail to pay respect to his years and his principles, beginning my address by a respectful apology for interrupting his labours. The old man intermitted the operation of the chisel, took off his spectacles and wiped them, then, replacing them on his nose, acknowledged my courtesy by a suitable return. Encouraged by his affability, I intruded upon him some questions concerning the sufferers on whose monument he was now employed. To talk of the exploits of the Covenanters was his delight, as to repair their monuments was the business of his life. He was profuse in the communication of all the minute information which he had collected concerning them, their wars and their wanderings. One would almost have supposed he must have been their contemporary, and have actually beheld the passages which he related, so much had he identified his feelings and opinions with theirs, and so much had his narratives of circumstantiality of an eyewitness. "Weh," he said in a tone of exultation, "we are the only true Whigs. Carnal men have assumed the triumphant appellation, following him whose kingdom is of this world. Which of them would sit 6 hours on a wet hillside to hear a godly sermon? I trow an hour would straw with them. They are ne'er a hair better than them that shamina to take upon themselves the persecuting name of the bloodthirsty Tories. Self-seekers all of them, strivers after wealth, power, and worldly ambition, and forgetters alike of what has been dreed and done by the mighty men who stood up in the gap in the great day of wrath. Nae wonder they dread the accomplishment of what was spoken by the mouth of the worldly Mr. Piddin, that precious servant of the Lord, none of whose words fell to the ground, that the French Monseys, no, probably Monseigneurs, it would seem that this was spoken during the apprehensions and invasion from France, publishers, sall rise as fast in the glens of Ayr and the kens of Galway as e'er the Highlandmen did in 1677, and now they are gripping the bow into the spear, when they should be mourning for a sinful land and a broken covenant." Soothing the old man by letting his peculiar opinions pass without contradiction, and anxious to prolong conversation with so singular a character, I prevailed upon him to accept that hospitality which Mr. Cleishbotham is always willing to extend to those who need it. In our way to the schoolmaster's house, we called at the Wallace Inn, where I was pretty certain I should find my patron about an hour of the evening. After a courteous interchange of civilities, old Mortality was, with difficulty, prevailed to join upon his host in a single glass of liquor, that on condition he should be permitted to name the pledge, which he prefaced with a grace of about 5 minutes, and then, with bonnet doffed and eyes uplifted, drank to the memory of those heroes of the kirk who had first uplifted her banner upon the mountains. As no persuasion could prevail on him to extend his conviviality to a second cup, my patron accompanied him home, and accommodated him in the prophet's chamber, as it is his pleasure to call the closet which holds a spare bed, and which is frequently a place of retreat for the poor traveller. Note, he may have added, for the rich also, since, I laud my stars, the great of the earth have also taken harbourage in my poor domicile, and returning the service of my handmaiden, Dorothy, who was buxom and comely of aspect, his honour the Laird of Smacoa, in his peregrinations to and from the metropolis, was wont to prefer my prophet's chamber even to the sanded chamber of dice in the Wallace Inn, and to bestow a muchkin, as he would jocosely say, to obtain the freedom of the house, but in reality to assure himself of my company during the evening. J.C. The next day I took leave of old Mortality, who seemed affected by the unusual attention with which I had cultivated his acquaintance and listened to his conversation. After he had mounted, not without difficulty, the old white pony, he took me by the hand and said, "The blessing of our master be with you, young man. My hours are like the ears of the latter harvest, and your days are yet in the spring, and yet you may be gathered into the garner of mortality before me, for the sickle of death cuts down the green as oft as the ripe, and there is a colour in your cheek, that, like the bud of the rose, serveth oft to hide the worm of corruption. Wherefore labour as one who knoweth not when his master calleth, and if it be my lot to return to this village after ye are gane hame to your ain place, these auld withered hands will frame a stane of memorial, that your name may not perish from among the people." I thanked old Mortality for his kind intentions in my behalf, and heaved a sigh, not, I think, of regret, so much as of resignation, to think of the chance that I might soon require his good offices. But though in all human probability he did not err in supposing that my span of life may be abridged in youth, he had overestimated the period of his own pilgrimage on earth. It is now known some years since he has been missed in all his usual haunts, while moss, lichen, and deer hair are fast covering the stains, to cleanse which had been the business of his life. About the beginning of this century he closed his mortal toils, being found on the highway near Lockerbie in Dumfriesshire, exhausted and just expiring. The old white pony, the companion of all his wanderings, was standing by the side of his dying master. There was found about his person a sum of money sufficient for his decent interment, which serves to show that his death was in no ways hastened by violence or by want. The common people still regard his memory with great respect, and many are of opinion that the stones which he repaired will not again require assistance of the chisel. They even assert that on the tombs where the manner of the martyr's murder is recorded, their names have remained indelibly legible since the death of old Mortality, while those of the persecutors, sculptured on the same monuments, have been entirely defaced. It is hardly necessary to say that this is a fond imagination, and that, since the time of the pious pilgrim, the monuments which were the object of his care are hastening, like all earthly memorials, into ruin or decay. My readers will of course understand that in embodying into one compressed narrative many of the anecdotes which I had the advantage of deriving from old Mortality, I have been far from adopting either his style, his opinions, or even his facts, so far as they appear to have been distorted by party prejudice. I have endeavoured to correct or verify them from the most authentic sources of the tradition, afforded by the representatives of either party. On the part of the Presbyterians, I have consulted such moorland farmers from the Western District as, by the kindness of their landlords, or otherwise, have been able, during the late general change of property, to retain possession of the grazings on which their grandsires fed their flocks and herds. I must own that, of late days, I have found this a limited source of information. I have, therefore, called in the supplementary aid of those modest itinerants, whom the scrupulous civility of our ancestors denominated travelling merchants, but whom, of late, accommodating ourselves in this as in more material particulars, to the feelings and sentiments of our more wealthy neighbours, we have learned to call packmen, or pedlars. To country weavers travelling in hopes to get rid of their winter web, but more especially to tailors who, from their sedentary profession, and the necessity in our country of exercising it by temporary residence in the families by whom they are employed, may be considered as possessing a complete register or roll of traditions, I have been indebted for many illustrations of their narratives of old Mortality, much in the taste of the spirit of the original. I had more difficulty in finding materials for connecting the tone of partiality which evidently pervaded those stories of traditional learning, in order that I might be enabled to present an unbiased picture of the manners of that unhappy period, and, at the same time, to do justice to the merits of both parties. But I have been enabled to qualify the narratives of old Mortality and his Cameronian friends by the reports of more than one descendant of ancient and honourable families, who, themselves decayed into the humble vale of life, yet look proudly back on the period when their ancestors fought and fell in behalf of the exiled House of Stuart. I may even boast right reverend authority on the same score for more than one non-juring bishop, whose authority and income were upon as apostolical a scale as the greatest abominator of episcopacy could well desire, have deigned, while partaking of the humble cheer of the Wallace Inn, to furnish me with information corrective of the facts which I learned from others. There are also here and there a laird or two who, though they shrug their shoulders, profess no great shame in their fathers having served in the persecuting squadrons of Earl Charles and Claverhouse. From the gamekeepers of those gentlemen, an office the most apt of any other to become hereditary in such families, I have also contrived to collect much valuable information. Upon the whole, I can hardly fear that, at this time, in describing the operation which their opposite principles produced upon the good and bad men of both parties, I can be suspected of meaning insult or injustice to either. If a recollection of former injuries, extra loyalty, and contempt and hatred of their adversaries produced rigour and tyranny in the one party, it will hardly be denied, on the other hand, that, if the zeal for God's house did not eat up the conventiclers, it devoured, at least, to intimate the phrase of Dryden, no small portion of their loyalty, sober sense, and good breeding. We may safely hope that the souls of the brave and sincere on either side have long looked down with surprise and pity upon the ill-appreciated motives which caused their mutual hatred and hostility, while in this valley of darkness, blood, and tears. Peace to their memory. Let us think of them as the heroine of our only Scottish tragedy entreats her lord to think of her departed sire. Oh, rake not up the ashes of our fathers. Implacable resentment was their crime, and grievous has that expiation been.